I was ordered to watch humans in battle. Now I wish I had never seen it. My name is Vel Orak of the 9th Observation Fleet, and I am writing this account because my superior, High Watcher Densol, told me to write everything down before my memory fades or my mind chooses to forget what it witnessed on the 3rd moon of Careth Prime. I was not a soldier. I had never been near a war zone. My function in the Galactic Council's Observer Corps was simple: go to places where events of importance were happening, watch those events, and return with a full report. I had done this 22 times before the assignment that changed me. I had watched asteroid mining operations. I had recorded trade disputes between the Veth and the Sorlan. I had spent 2 full cycles observing the mating season of the blue cloud creatures of Den 4, which was admittedly more dramatic than expected, but nothing that left scars. Then they gave me the human assignment. The briefing was short. The Galactic Council had agreed to allow a small human military unit to assist in clearing out a nest of Harith raiders from the 3rd moon of Careth Prime. The Harith had been using the moon as a staging ground for attacks on 3 allied trade routes, and the Council's own peacekeeping forces had already tried twice to remove them and failed both times. Someone in the High Chamber had suggested calling in the humans. There had been a long silence after that suggestion, the kind of silence that happens when everyone in the room knows something uncomfortable but no one wants to say it first. They approved it, and they sent me to watch. It is a standard engagement," Densol told me during the briefing, his 4 eyes calm and steady in the way that always meant he was not telling me everything. "The humans have agreed to the mission parameters. You will embed with the unit, observe, and report on their methods and effectiveness. The Council wants data." "Data on what specifically?" I asked. "On how they fight," he said. "On whether the stories are accurate." I asked him what stories he meant. He looked at me for a long moment, then said, "Just watch everything, Velorak. Write it all down." I arrived at the human staging area 2 days before the operation was set to begin. The humans were already there, moving around their temporary base camp with a kind of loose, unhurried energy that I found immediately confusing. And I had expected soldiers to look like soldiers, rigid, formal, precise. The Council's peacekeeping forces always moved in careful formations, spoke in measured tones, and held their equipment with both hands at all times. These humans did not do that. The unit was led by a sergeant named Cole Brady, a broad-shouldered man with a close-cut beard and pale gray eyes that had a habit of looking directly at you without blinking for slightly too long. He was the first human to approach me when I arrived at the camp perimeter, and he walked with the easy stride of someone who had never in his life been unsure of where he was putting his feet. "You're the Watcher," he said. It was not a question. "I am Vel Orak," I told him, "of the Observation Corps." "Great," he said, and then he held out one hand, palm flat and fingers together. I'd in the greeting gesture I had read about in the human cultural briefing packet. I pressed my forward limb against it, as I had been instructed to do. He gripped my limb briefly, firmly, then let go. "You can follow along wherever you need to, but when I say get down, you get down. When I say stay back, you stay back. You understand?" "I understand," I said. "Good," he said, and then he walked back to whatever he had been doing before I arrived, which appeared to be eating something from a small gray pouch while leaning against a supply crate and reading something on a flat-screen device. I spent the next 2 days observing the unit and taking notes. There were 11 of them total. Their names were Cole Brady, Danny Ortiz, Kevin Shaw, Lisa Garner, Pete Holloway, Donna Reyes, Carl Vance, Trace Whitmore, Sam Ellison, Becca Norris, and Hector Louise. They ranged in age from what I calculated to be very young to moderately old for a human lifespan. They came from different regions of their planet, spoke with different patterns in their voices, and had very different physical appearances. Under any other military framework I had studied, this kind of variation in a unit would signal poor cohesion. It would mean communication gaps and chain of command confusion. But watching them for those 2 days, I did not see confusion. I saw something harder to describe. They moved around each other the way water moves around stone, naturally, without needing to think about it. Danny Ortiz made a joke in the middle of weapons check, and Lisa Garner threw a small object at him without looking up from her equipment, and he caught it without looking either, and they both laughed. And then they both went back to work without missing a beat. Pete Holloway and Carl Vance communicated in short word fragments that didn't seem to form complete sentences, but that they both understood completely. Cole Brady said almost nothing to anyone, but every few hours he would walk through the camp slowly, and when he walked through, everyone got slightly more focused without him saying a word. On the night before the operation, I sat at the edge of the camp and wrote in my field log. I noted that the humans were physically unremarkable by galactic standards. No enhanced sensory organs, no natural armor, shorter lifespan than most spacefaring species, fragile skeletal structure. I noted that their equipment was functional but not exceptional. I noted that they seemed psychologically stable and showed good unit cohesion. And then I wrote one more line before I closed the log and tried to rest. I do not yet understand what it is about these creatures that makes the Galactic Council speak of them in lowered voices. I would understand by this time tomorrow. I would understand, and I would spend a very long time wishing that I did not. The operation began at what the humans called 0400, which was the deep dark before their equivalent of dawn. I had not slept. I had tried, but there was something in the air of the camp that made it difficult, a kind of low, invisible tension that I could feel without being able to name it. The humans slept, most of them. Pete Holloway did not sleep. He sat at the edge of his sleeping area, cleaning his rifle in the dark with the calm, the mechanical focus of someone doing something they had done so many times it required no thought at all. When Cole Brady moved through the camp at 0330 and said a single word, up, every human was on their feet within 40 seconds. There was no grumbling. There was no confusion. They dressed, checked their equipment, ate quickly from their field rations, and formed up at the camp's edge without being told twice about anything. I watched this and recorded it. Efficient, I wrote. Faster than most military units I have observed. No wasted motion in preparation. I had no idea what preparation had actually been for. The third moon of Carith Prime was a cold, rocky place, with a thin atmosphere and low gravity. Low enough that a careful jump could carry you 3 times the height a similar jump would achieve on Earth. And the terrain was broken and jagged, all gray stone and deep shadow crevices, with the Harith stronghold sitting inside a natural crater at the moon's northern pole. The Council's previous attempts to clear the stronghold had failed because the Harith had fortified the crater rim entirely. Any approach meant crossing open ground while under fire from elevated positions, and the Harith's plasma repeaters could cover every angle of that open ground with overlapping fields of fire. The Council's forces had tried to solve this problem with overwhelming numbers. It had not worked. The Harith simply had more cover, more elevation, and more time to reload than the approaching force had time to survive. Cole Brady's solution, as he explained it to his unit in a flat, unhurried voice during the pre-operation briefing, was different. "Oh, we don't go at the rim," he said. "We go under it." He pointed to a section of the crater wall on the terrain map where geological scanning had identified a narrow cave system running beneath the fortified positions. It was tight, barely enough room for one person to move through at a time, in full kit, in low gravity. The Harith had not fortified it because no sane military planner would send soldiers into a single-file tunnel directly beneath an enemy position with no room to maneuver and no line of retreat. Cole Brady was sending his soldiers into exactly that. "Once we're inside the crater perimeter," he continued, They lose their elevation advantage. We clear the inner positions, move to the repeater nests from below, and take them out. The Hareth don't like close quarters. But they never have. How do we know they don't have the caves monitored? Trace Whitmore asked. We don't, Cole said. There was a brief pause. Okay, Trace said. That was the entire conversation about the risk. One question, one honest answer, one acknowledgement, and then they moved on. I wrote this down. I found it deeply strange. Every other military culture I had observed spent extensive time in pre-operation discussion of contingency plans, fallback positions, and risk assessment. These humans asked one question, got a bad answer, and moved on as if the bad answer was simply the weather, unpleasant, but not worth more than a moment's acknowledgement. We entered the cave system at 0440. I followed at the back of the column, behind Becca Norris, who was the unit's field medic. She moved through the cave with a low, controlled efficiency that suggested she had practiced moving in tight spaces. Everyone moved quietly. The low gravity made it slightly surreal. Each footstep had to be placed carefully, or you would rise too high and strike the cave ceiling. The humans adapted to this within the first few minutes without instruction. They watched how the low gravity affected each other's movement and adjusted their own without discussion. The caves were dark. The humans wore night vision equipment over their eyes that made them look like strange mechanical insects in the faint ambient light. I had my own optical enhancement equipment and could see well enough, but the tunnel was disorienting. Long and narrow and cold, with the sound of nothing except careful breathing and the soft scrape of boots on stone. Then, without warning, the shooting started, and it came from ahead. A sharp cracking sound that was completely unlike the plasma fire I had heard in previous conflict zone recordings. Human firearms, I had read in the cultural briefing, used chemically propelled projectiles. The sound they made in an enclosed stone tunnel was enormous. It was not the clean, high-pitched whistle of energy weapons. It was something that hit you in the chest and rang in every surface around you simultaneously. Cole Brady's voice cut through it immediately. Not panicked, not raised in fear. It was raised in volume, the way someone raises their voice to be heard over machinery. Contact front, Ortiz, Vance, push up, Shaw, left wall, Garner, lay down suppression. And they moved. That was the thing that I recorded first, and that I have tried most often since to explain to other observers who were not there. They moved toward the sound. Every other species I had ever studied had a base survival response when confronted with sudden violence in a confined space, freeze or retreat. The Galactic Council's peacekeeping forces were trained extensively to override this response, and even with that training, the average response time before a soldier moved forward under surprise contact was between 4 and 7 seconds. The humans moved in under 2. Danny Ortiz went past me in the tunnel so fast that the displacement of air moved my field recorder. Kevin Shaw pressed himself against the left wall and moved forward along it in a low crouch. Lisa Garner dropped to one knee behind a slight bend in the tunnel, and her weapon began a rapid, rhythmic thunder that shook dust from the cave ceiling. I pressed myself flat against the tunnel wall and could not move. I told myself it was tactical positioning. I told myself I was staying out of their way. But the truth, which I am putting in this account because Densol told me to put everything in, is that I was frozen. The sound, the speed, the violence of it. My body simply stopped responding to instructions from my brain. And while I stood frozen, the humans went forward. The noise in that tunnel was beyond anything my observer training had prepared me for. I had reviewed combat recordings before this assignment. I had watched documented footage of 6 different species engaged in armed conflict. I had read the Council's clinical reports on projectile weapon acoustics, on the physiological effects of stress hormones in humanoid biology, on the documented behavior of trained soldiers in close-quarters engagements. None of it meant anything in that tunnel. The recordings had no smell. They had no physical pressure. They did not produce the particular quality of sound that a gun makes when fired in a stone passage. A sound that is less like a noise and more like a physical event, something that you do not hear so much as receive in your whole body at once. The Harith had stationed 3 of their number inside the cave system. I would find out later that they had, in fact, monitored the tunnels. They simply had not believed any military unit would enter them. The 3 Harith inside the tunnels were, by their own species standards, seasoned fighters. They had survived both of the Council's previous clearing attempts. They had very good weapons and a defensible position and complete surprise on their side. They lasted approximately 90 seconds against Cole Brady's unit. I could see pieces of it from where I was pressed against the tunnel wall. Cole had gone forward himself the moment the first exchange of fire began, moving past his own soldiers in the tunnel with a low, rolling motion that kept his head below the line where the Harith were directing their fire. He moved without hesitation into ground that active weapons fire was passing through, and I watched this, and my mind could not process it the way a normal observation processes input. It simply sat there in my memory, undigested, because nothing in my experience had given me the proper container to put it in. So Kevin Shaw was hit. I saw it happen. A Harith plasma bolt caught him along the right arm, burning through the upper layer of his equipment and into the flesh beneath. The sound he made was sharp and immediate, and then it stopped. He did not fall back. He shifted his weapon to a lower position that allowed him to use his left arm more, pressed his right arm against his side, and kept moving forward along the wall. I wrote this down later from memory because in the moment I could not make my hands work the recording equipment. I simply watched. Becca Norris moved past me without looking at me, her medical kit bouncing against her back, her weapon in her hands, her eyes forward. She was not going to Kevin yet. She was moving toward the front of the engagement. Oh, I realized after a moment that she was going to where she would be needed most, which might not be where the first person had been hurt. She had made a calculation about probable outcomes and was positioning herself accordingly, and she had done this while moving through an active firefight in a low-gravity tunnel in the dark. The 3 Harith were eliminated. I am using the Council's clinical language for this, because my own instincts when I try to describe it produce words that are too large and too raw for an observation report. Cole Brady's voice in the aftermath was the same as it had been before. Not triumphant, not relieved, just operational. Shaw, Norris has you. Ortiz, Vance on me. Everyone else hold the tunnel and watch the rear. Becca reached Kevin and had his arm exposed and sealed within 40 seconds. And I watched her work. She did not speak to him in a comforting way. She gave him information, what she was doing, what it would feel like, what he needed to do next. And Kevin listened, nodded, and asked one question. "Can I still shoot with it?" "Yes," Becca said. "Then I'm fine," he said. The unit pushed out of the cave system and into the inner crater 9 minutes after first contact. I followed because the alternative was to remain alone in a dark tunnel. With 3 Harith the unit had just eliminated, and my body made that choice before my brain formally approved it. The inner crater was open to the sky, a wide, rocky bowl with the Harith's main defensive installations visible around the interior rim. From below, with the crater walls around them, the humans had negated the elevation advantage that had defeated 2 previous operations. From the Harith's perspective, the threat had appeared from exactly the direction it was not supposed to be able to come from. The Harith were, by the accounts I would read in the after-action reports, disciplined and well-led fighters. They adapted to new threats with reasonable speed and had procedures for exactly this kind of flank breach. Their procedures were not fast enough. What happened in the next 11 minutes, I have reviewed in my own memory more times than is probably healthy for an observer of my species. I keep going back to specific moments, trying to find the point at which my understanding of the humans shifted from analytical to something that I do not have a clean word for in my language. I think it was Danny Ortiz. He had moved to the left flank of the inner crater push. working with Carl Vance to close the angle on one of the Harith repeater nests. The nest had 3 Harith operators behind heavy cover, fabricated barriers that could absorb significant weapons fire. The standard tactical response to a fortified nest in open ground is to suppress it, while another element maneuvers around it, which takes time and coordination. Danny did not do the standard thing. He assessed the distance, the cover available, the angle, and then he simply ran at it. Not in a reckless, unthinking way. I want to be clear about this. Watching the recording I managed to capture later, you can see the calculation in how he moved, the way he angled his approach to stay out of the optimal firing line, and the way he communicated his intention to Carl with a single hand gesture before he went. It was tactically informed aggression, which is somehow more alarming than thoughtless aggression, because thoughtless aggression has limits that self-awareness can enforce. Danny's aggression had no enforced limits. He had assessed the situation and decided that running directly at a fortified position was the correct answer, and so he ran at it, and he was right. I watched this and felt something shift inside me. It was not admiration, though there was something like that mixed in. It was closer to the feeling you get when you realize that the universe contains a category of thing you did not know existed. When the map of reality you have been carrying quietly gets a new continent drawn onto it. These humans were not brave the way the Council's training manuals described bravery. They were not overcoming fear. Or if they were, the overcoming was so fast and so complete that it did not look like a struggle at all. It looked like a preference. I wrote that in my field log while crouched behind a rock outcrop in the inner crater with weapons fire going back and forth 20 meters away. It looks like a preference, I wrote. And then I looked up and watched Cole Brady give a hand signal that sent 3 humans simultaneously toward 3 different positions, and all 3 went without hesitation, and I understood that I had seen nothing yet. The battle for the inner crater lasted 31 minutes. I know this because I checked the timestamp on my field recorder when it ended. In the moment, it felt like it had taken the entire day. Time had behaved strangely for me from the moment the shooting started in the tunnel, expanding and compressing in ways that had nothing to do with actual duration. 11 minutes felt like an hour. A 30-second sprint across open ground felt like it passed in 4 seconds. I have spoken with other observers since about this effect, and they have confirmed it is a documented response to proximity to sustained violence. The biological processing systems prioritize survival data and sacrifice accurate timekeeping to do it. The humans did not appear to experience this. Their communication throughout the engagement was consistent and temporally coherent. They called out information with accurate distance estimates and timing references. Cole Brady, at the 17-minute mark, said we have about 12 minutes before the Eastern Harith group repositions to that ridgeline. And he was correct to within 40 seconds. At minute 22, Pete Holloway was hit. It was a projectile round from a Harith secondary weapon. The Harith had brought out smaller arms once the repeater nests started falling, trying to buy time and space to reorganize their defense. Pete went down hard. The round had gone into his left leg below the knee, and he could not stand. He went down behind the cover of a boulder and called out his own status in a flat, clear voice. Holloway down, left leg, can still shoot. And then he shot. I watched Pete Holloway lie on his side behind a boulder in the low gravity of the third moon of Carith Prime with a round in his leg, prop himself up on one elbow, and continue providing accurate weapons fire in support of his unit for the remaining 9 minutes of the engagement. He did not call for evacuation. He did not stop communicating. When Sam Ellison moved into a position that Pete could see was badly angled relative to an active Harith firing point, Pete said, "Ellison, your left, Harith in the lower vent cover," and Sam adjusted and the information was correct, and Pete went back to shooting. I stopped trying to write field notes at this point. Not because I had run out of space or equipment, but because I had run out of the capacity to process and record simultaneously. My entire cognitive capacity had been absorbed by what I was watching. I simply watched, and my memory recorded it the way a wound records the thing that caused it. Completely, involuntarily, and in a form that does not fade. The final Harith position fell at minute 31 when Cole Brady, Donna Reyes, and Hector Luis moved on it from three sides in a coordinated approach that had been communicated entirely in hand signals and brief word fragments while the rest of the unit maintained suppression. The Harith inside that final position had two options: surrender or be overrun. They chose surrender, which in retrospect was the wiser decision, and the engagement ended. The silence that followed was almost more difficult than the noise. It was not a quiet silence. It was the silence that happens when a large, violent sound stops and everything in your nervous system is still responding to the echo. My auditory organs were ringing. The rocks around me were still slightly warm from energy weapon discharge, and the thin atmosphere of the moon carried a sharp smell that I later identified as a combination of combusted propellant and superheated stone. Cole Brady said, "Sound off," and his unit answered one by one, each voice confirming their status. When Pete Holloway answered, his voice was the same as everyone else's: clipped, functional, present. Then Cole said, "Norris," and Becca was already moving toward Pete without being told. What happened next was the part I have thought about the most. I expected the unit to reorganize immediately. I expected the clinical efficiency I had watched for 2 days to reassert itself. Equipment checks, position security, report upward to the Council's liaison. And those things happened, but they happened alongside something else that I had not anticipated and that my observer training had not mentioned. And the humans checked on each other. Not in a formal way. Not in a way that followed any procedure I could identify. Cole walked to where Kevin Shaw was sitting while Becca finished securing Pete's leg, and he crouched down next to Kevin and looked at his arm and said something in a low voice that I was not close enough to hear. Kevin said something back. Cole put one hand briefly on Kevin's shoulder and then stood and walked to the next person. Trace Whitmore sat down on a low rock and stared at nothing for approximately 90 seconds. Danny Ortiz sat down next to him without speaking and stayed there. After 90 seconds, Trace exhaled slowly and said something short. Danny nodded. They both stood up and went back to their tasks. Lisa Garner walked to the spot where the first Harith contact had happened in the tunnel entry, the point where the unit had broken through into the crater, and she stood there looking at it for a moment. Then she turned around and went back to helping Carl Vance with the equipment inventory. I do not know what each of these moments meant to them individually. My understanding of human internal states is not detailed enough to say with confidence what Trace Whitmore was doing in those 90 seconds of stillness, or what Lisa was looking for at the tunnel entry, or what Cole said to Kevin in that low voice. But I understood the shape of what I was watching, even without the specifics. They had been through something. They were taking one moment in their own way to acknowledge that. And then they were returning to function. But I found this more unsettling than anything that had happened during the fighting. During the fighting, the humans had been extraordinary in ways that my categories for extraordinary could at least partially contain. They were fast. They were aggressive. They had very high pain tolerance, an unusual willingness to accept risk. These are things I could write in a report using the Council's standard terminology. But this brief, quiet, individual reckoning with what had just occurred, followed by the immediate return to capability. This did not fit in any category I had. The Harith soldiers I had observed in recordings did not do this. The Council's peacekeeping forces did not do this, not in the field. Most species either had more visible distress responses or fewer. The humans had both simultaneously a full emotional registration of what they had experienced, acknowledged privately, and then set aside with what appeared to be a practiced and permanent efficiency. They felt everything, and they kept going anyway. I sat on a rock at the edge of the inner crater and looked at the sky above Carith Prime's third moon, which was a deep, clear black with a scatter of unfamiliar stars. And I thought about what I was going to write in my official report to the Galactic Council. I could write about tactics, I could write about weapons handling and pain threshold and unit cohesion under fire. All of that would be accurate and useful, but it would not be honest. Not completely. The honest thing, the thing I had actually learned that day, was something that numbers and clinical terminology could not carry. And I had learned why the Galactic Council spoke about humanity in lowered voices, and I wished very much that I still didn't know. I filed my official report to the Galactic Council 14 days after the operation on the third moon of Carith Prime. It was the longest report I had ever submitted. It was also the hardest to write, not because of the volume of information, but because of the constant, exhausting effort of making the information fit into the Council's reporting format, which was designed for a universe that did not contain humans. The Council's field report template had sections for tactical effectiveness rating, weapons systems assessment, unit cohesion score, and recommended deployment parameters. It had been designed across centuries of observing dozens of species in conflict situations, and it was, for those species, a perfectly adequate tool. Numbers went into boxes. Behaviors were matched to pre-existing categories. A picture of military capability was assembled that the Council's strategists could use to make decisions. I filled out every section. I gave Cole Brady's unit the highest tactical effectiveness rating I had ever submitted in 23 assignments. I wrote detailed assessments of their weapons handling, their low-gravity adaptation speed, their communication discipline, and their capacity to execute complex maneuvers under sustained fire. And then I got to the final section, which was titled Observer Notes, and was intended for additional information that did not fit the preceding categories. I sat in front of that blank section for a long time. What I wrote in the end was not what I had planned to write, and I had intended to write a clean summary. Something about human pain tolerance and aggression profiles being outside normal galactic parameters. I had intended to keep it clinical and useful and contained within the kind of language that Council strategists were comfortable reading over their morning meals. Instead, I wrote the truth. I wrote about Kevin Shaw shifting his weapon to his good arm and continuing forward. I wrote about Pete Holloway shooting from the ground with a round in his leg for 9 minutes and calling out targeting information to his teammates while he did it. I wrote about Danny Ortiz calculating the tactical geometry of running directly at a fortified position and deciding that the calculation came out in favor of running, and then running. I wrote about the silence afterward. And I wrote about Cole's hand on Kevin's shoulder and Trace Whitmore's 90 seconds of stillness, and Lisa standing at the tunnel entry looking at something only she could see. I wrote that these things were not in any category my training had given me. And then I wrote the line that I knew would cause me problems. The Galactic Council should understand that what makes humanity dangerous is not their weapons capability, or their pain tolerance, or their tactical flexibility, though all of these are exceptional. What makes them dangerous is that they feel everything and stop for nothing. They register the full weight of what they are going through in real time, and they move forward anyway. And they do this not because they are incapable of feeling fear or grief or the knowledge of their own fragility, but because they have apparently decided as a species that none of those things are sufficient reason to stop. I do not have a tactical assessment category for this. I am not certain one exists. I submitted the report. The response from High Watcher Densol came within 4 hours, which was faster than any response I had ever received. It was short. It said, "Your Observer Notes section has been flagged for the High Chamber's review. Please be available for a debrief session at your earliest availability." I attended the debrief. There were 7 members of the High Chamber present, which was unusual. High Chamber members attended observer debriefs for one reason: when the information was important enough that they did not want to wait for it to travel through normal reporting channels. They asked me questions for 3 hours. They asked me to clarify the tactical details, which I did. They asked me to quantify things I had described qualitatively, which I tried to do, though some of them resisted quantification. They asked me whether I believed the unit I had observed was representative of humanity's military capability generally, or whether it had been an exceptional unit. I told them that I did not know. I told them that Cole Brady's unit had operated as though everything I had seen them do was simply what soldiers did, without any indication that they considered themselves unusual. I told them that if they were representative, the Council's existing models for human military capability were significantly underestimated. I told them that if they were exceptional, the Council should still revise its models significantly upward, because an exceptional human unit was unlike anything else in the documented record. One of the High Chamber members, an elder of the Velson species who had been on the chamber for longer than I had been alive, asked me the question directly. In your judgment, Velorak, if the Galactic Council ever had cause to engage humanity in open conflict, what would the outcome be? I thought about this for a moment. I thought about Cole Brady walking forward into fire without hesitation. I thought about Pete Holloway shooting from the ground with a wound that would have removed any other species soldier from the engagement entirely. I thought about that quiet crater after the shooting stopped, and the brief private reckoning each human took, and the speed with which they set it aside and returned to function. I would not recommend testing it, I said. The elder of the Velson was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That is not an answer." "It is the most honest answer I can give you," I told her. "I watched 11 humans clear a fortified position that defeated 2 previous operations, and I can give you casualty ratios and tactics assessments and deployment recommendations. But the honest answer to your question is that humanity fights in a way that does not respond well to calculation. They adjust, they absorb, they keep going, and at the individual level, each one of them has apparently made peace with the fact that they are fragile and mortal and could stop existing at any moment, and they have decided that this is not relevant to whether they move forward. I watched one of them lie on the ground with a wound in his leg and spend 9 minutes making sure his teammates had accurate information. That is the answer to your question." There was a long silence in the chamber. The elder of the Velson said quietly, "Yes, I see." And the debrief ended. They did not send me back. I was reassigned to the Cloud Creature Monitoring Program on Den 4, which I suspect was not a coincidence. The Council does not generally reassign effective observers away from high-priority subjects without a reason, and the most likely reason, as best I can determine, is that they already had everything they needed from my report and did not want another observer going back and coming home changed. I have been on Den 4 for 6 months now. The cloud creatures are enormous and slow and peaceful, and they communicate through color shifts in their outer membranes. It is very quiet work. I still think about the third moon of Kereth Prime. I think about it most at the end of a long observation day, when I sit at the edge of the monitoring station and watch the stars appear in the evening sky above Den 4's green oceans. I think about Pete Holloway shooting from the ground. I think about Danny Ortiz running. I think about that particular quality of silence after it was over. The moment when 11 humans who had just come through something enormous each took their own private measure of it, and then stood up and went back to work. And I think about what Cole Brady said to me when I found him after the debrief, before the unit shipped back to their transport and I returned to Council Transit. I had wanted to say something to him, something that captured what I had seen. I did not have the right words, so I said the simple thing. "Thank you for letting me observe." Cole Brady looked at me with those pale gray eyes for a moment. Then he said, "Write it down accurately." "I will," I told him. I did. I only wish I understood it better.